I want you to imagine the moment the whole thing started. Not the explosion, not the crisis, not the moment everything fell apart at the seams of the galaxy like old fabric finally giving way. I want you to imagine a room full of people laughing. Because that's where it actually began. The Galactic Commerce Council chambers on the Lashen station were built to impress. That was the point. Every square meter of that place was engineered to remind whoever walked through the doors that they were small, that the galaxy was enormous, and that the council that governed the flow of trade between 47 star systems was enormouser still. The ceiling was made of some composite material that shifted color, depending on the atmospheric mood of whatever species was currently speaking. When the Vrethkai delegates spoke, it turned a deep amber. When the Uli cluster representative raised her trivocal harmonics to address the chamber, it shimmered into pale violet. The floor was transparent, actual transparent composite over a 300-meter drop into the station's central reactor column, which glowed a soft blue-white and made everyone feel slightly unsteady, no matter how many times they'd stood there. It was that kind of room. The kind built specifically to make you feel small so that the people running it could feel appropriately large. On the day the laughter started, I was standing in the observer's gallery on the upper tier. I was there as a junior trade liaison for the Meridian Commerce Bureau, which basically meant I carried documents, kept my mouth shut, and tried not to embarrass myself in front of species that had been conducting interstellar negotiations for longer than my entire homeworld had been sentient. My name, for the record, is Coordinator Pelastine. I'm putting that down because this document needs a witness, and I was there. I saw all of it. What triggered the laughter was a presentation. Specifically, it was a presentation by a newly formed security and logistics firm called Frontier Solutions, LLC. And Frontier Solutions, LLC, was run by humans. There were 3 of them at the presentation table, humans, standing up there in the middle of the Galactic Commerce Council chamber like they belonged, which, and I say this without cruelty, just accuracy, they did not yet have the reputation to justify. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Commerce Network for about 40 years by that point. 40 years sounds like a long time. In galactic terms, it was less than a breath. Most of the species in that chamber had been trading with each other for centuries, some for millennia. The Vrethkai had been running deep space commerce lanes before humans had invented the wheel. So when these 3 humans, I'll describe them in a moment, stood up in front of the council and proposed to provide security and operational support for the Kethvara relay station, the single most critical logistical hub in the known galaxy, the response was not enthusiasm. The response was laughter. Real, genuine, multi-species laughter, the kind that sounds different depending on who's doing it. The Vrethkai delegates made a clicking hissing sound like a bag of cutlery being shaken. The Uli representative let out a resonant low hum that I'm told is the acoustic equivalent of absolute mockery. The Lashen Council members, the host species, who I always thought had better manners, exchanged looks with each other that somehow communicated the entire concept of "you're not serious" without a single word. And one of the senior council members, a Vrethkai diplomat named Keth Advisor S. Sarvan Thrall, 7 feet of scaled, 6-limbed sophistication, who had been doing interstellar diplomacy for something like 200 years, leaned forward at his elevated dais and said, loudly enough for the whole chamber to hear, "You actually hired humans. That's insanity." It wasn't said to the humans specifically. It was said to Council Chair Melda Oris, a Lashen woman who had, apparently, actually been considering the proposal. And the whole chamber erupted again. I remember watching the 3 humans at the presentation table. I want to describe them now because I think it matters. The one in the center, the one who was clearly the lead, the one who had been presenting, was a woman named Dira Voss. She was maybe 40 years old by human reckoning, which is young in most galactic species terms but apparently considered mature for a human. She was compact in that way humans often are, built solidly, with short dark hair and the kind of face that has been through weather. Not violent weather. Just the long, slow kind that comes from doing hard work in difficult places for a long time. She did not flinch when the laughter started. That was the first thing I noticed. She waited. She stood there at the presentation table with her hands flat on the surface, and she waited for the laughter to finish, the way you wait for a storm to pass before continuing your conversation. Not scared, not angry, just waiting. To her left was a man named Korsman Jeet Haverson. Former military, you could tell, not from anything flashy, just from the way he stood. Relaxed in the particular way that people who have been trained to be ready at all moments actually relax, which is to say not entirely. His eyes were moving around the chamber slowly and continuously, cataloging exits, I realized later, just quietly noting where everything was. To her right was a younger woman, genuinely young, maybe mid-20s, named Analyst Petrasova. She had a tablet in her hands and she was doing something that I didn't understand at the time. She was writing things down, during the laughter. In the middle of all of it, she was making notes, her stylus moving quickly across the surface, her face completely neutral. Later I found out what she was writing. I'll come back to that. When the laughter settled, Dira Voss said, simply and clearly, "We'll take that as a no then, and move on to our contingency plan." And she clicked to the next slide. Council Chair Melda Orris did not entirely dismiss the proposal that day. That surprised people. It surprised me, standing up in the observer's gallery, and it clearly surprised Keth Advisor S. Sarvan Thrall, who made the cutlery shaking noise again, but in a more pointed register this time. Chair Orris was a Thalassan, which meant she was physically something like a tall, pale-skinned person with an extra pair of arms folded close to her torso and eyes that went fully silver when she was being analytical. She'd been council chair for 60 years. She hadn't gotten there by being sentimental. After the session ended, she requested a private meeting with the three humans. I know what happened in that meeting because it was recorded and because, much later, after everything that happened at Kethvara, the recording was made part of the public historical record. So I'm going to describe it to you almost verbatim, because it matters. They met in a smaller room off the main chamber. Just the four of them, Chair Orris, Dira Voss, Korsman Haverson, and Analyst Sova. Orris had dismissed her aides for the conversation. The room had a window looking out into open space, and the light from the station's local star came in at an angle that made everything look slightly bronze. Orris folded all four of her arms, which for the Lashans is a posture of serious consideration, and said, "Explain to me why I shouldn't simply thank you for the presentation and show you to the departure bay." Dira Voss sat down across from her, didn't wait to be invited to sit, just sat down, which is a human thing that still startles other species sometimes, and said, "Because the Kethvara relay station has had 3 security failures in the last 8 years. The third one cost the Uli cluster 40 billion credits in delayed shipments. And every time, you patched the hole with the same kind of solution, and every time the hole got bigger." Orris said, "Our security systems are among the most sophisticated." "Your security systems are among the most sophisticated in the galaxy," Dira said. "That's true. Your response protocols are also completely predictable because they're completely rational. Every decision tree branches the same way every time because your systems are built on logical frameworks, and logical frameworks produce consistent outputs." Haverson spoke up then, "Which means anyone who studies the system long enough can predict the outputs." "And someone has," Petrasova said, without looking up from her tablet. "We've been running threat analysis modeling on the Kethvara attack patterns for 6 months. The incursions are not random. They are systematic probes, Someone is mapping your response architecture. There was a silence in the room that I'm told felt like the moment before the pressure drops before a storm. Chair Oris's eyes went silver. That information, she said slowly, is not public. No, said Dira Voss. It isn't. We reverse engineered it from the public incident reports and the shipping delay patterns. If we could figure it out from outside, whoever's doing it definitely figured it out from closer. Another silence. What is your proposal precisely? Oris said. Dira Voss said, let us embed a team on Kethvara, not to replace your systems, to supplement them with something your systems can't replicate. Which is? Unpredictability, Dira said, instinct. The ability to make decisions that don't follow logical frameworks because we don't always think in logical frameworks. And a very particular human skill that translates across every engagement environment we've ever operated in. What skill? Jeet Haverson leaned forward slightly. He said it in a quiet voice, almost conversational. We're very good at refusing to lose when everyone agrees we should. Chair Oris approved a provisional contract. Not full operational authority. Not even close. A 3-month observer embed 6 humans, operating as consultants, with no direct authority over station security systems, but with the right to make recommendations and the right to move freely through the station. When this got out, and it got out quickly, because nothing in galactic politics stays secret, the response from the other council members was fierce. S. Sarvan Thrall formally requested a review. 3 other senior delegates filed letters of concern. The Vrethkai Security Consortium, which had held the exclusive contract for Kethvara station security for 60 years, sent a 9,000-word objection document to the council. The objection document included the line, humans have been spacefaring for less than half a century. Their physiological limitations, cognitive inconsistencies, and unquantifiable emotional responses make them categorically unsuitable for sensitive security operations. I remember reading that document and thinking, well, they're not wrong about any of those things individually. What they were wrong about was the conclusion. I wasn't part of the Kethvara deployment. I want to be clear about that. I didn't go to the station. I stayed in my junior liaison role on the Lashen station, and I watched what happened from reports and dispatches, and, eventually, from the testimonies gathered afterward. But I did meet the full team before they shipped out. There was a transit lounge situation, delays, as always with interstellar transit, delays, and the 6 humans were waiting in the same lounge as a delegation from my bureau. And we ended up in the kind of accidentally prolonged conversation that happens when you're all stuck waiting for a dock to clear. The full team was Dira Voss, Korsman Jeet Haverson, Analyst Petrasova, and 3 others. Specialist Yaw Akampong, who was the largest human I'd ever been physically near. Not large in a threatening way, large in the way that large things sometimes are, with a kind of absolute occupancy of space that doesn't need to advertise itself. He spoke rarely, and when he did it was worth listening to. Technician Rosalind M. Hara, who was the kind of human who never seemed to be entirely in any room, because part of her mind was always somewhere else solving a problem. She had the slightly distant expression of someone perpetually in the middle of a complicated calculation. She was apparently some kind of equipment specialist. And Dr. Fennec Cow, the team medic, who was a small, energetic man with graying hair and the chaotic energy of someone who has spent a career fixing things under conditions that were not designed for fixing things. I spoke to a few of them during the delay. I spoke to Petrasova mostly. She was the easiest to talk to, or at least the most likely to actually answer questions. I asked her what she thought of the council's reception of their proposal. She said without any particular bitterness, about what we expected. I said, doesn't that bother you, being laughed at in there? She looked at me for a moment. Her eyes were very sharp, very clear. She said, Sarvan Thrall has been in interstellar diplomacy for 200 years. He has a right to be skeptical of us. I said, but... She said, but being old and experienced doesn't mean you're right about everything. Sometimes it means you've found a set of assumptions that worked long enough that you've stopped questioning them. She went back to her tablet. I asked, what are you always writing? She said, notes, observations, things I don't want to forget. She paused then. I'm also building a threat probability model for the station. Want to see? I looked at the screen. It was dense, complicated, a web of interconnected variables I couldn't begin to parse. I said, I have no idea what I'm looking at. She said, that's fine. I'm not sure I do either yet, but I will. She looked out the viewport at the stars and said, that's sort of the whole thing, isn't it? You don't have to understand something fully before you commit to figuring it out. The transit dock cleared. They shipped out to Kethvara Relay Station. For the first 2 months, nothing happened. Nothing notable, I mean. The humans embedded themselves, learned the station layout, attended briefings, filed their consultation reports. The Vrethkai security units stationed there mostly ignored them. There were some reports of friction. The Vrethkai don't mix easily with other species in professional settings, and they had a particular resistance to being observed by creatures they considered junior. Korsman Haverson apparently had a notable interaction with a Vrethkai security officer named Uniketh Seven Serath, who blocked his access to a monitoring corridor and told him, in Vrethkai trade standard, that the corridor was restricted to certified security personnel. Haverson said, I'm certified. Seven Serath said, your certification is from the Sol Tertiary Defense Commission. That certification carries no operational weight here. Haverson said, is the certification what keeps the corridor secure, or is it my actual presence and skill? Seven Serath said, that is a semantically invalid distinction. Haverson said, sure, can I get past? He didn't get past, but the story circulated among both human and Vrethkai personnel in the way these small friction stories do, and I think it established something about how Haverson operated that matters for later. He didn't escalate, he didn't argue, he absorbed the friction and kept working. In the 7th week, Petrasova submitted a report. The report was 32 pages long, and its central conclusion was simple. The probe attacks on Kethvara were being conducted by a Kethvaran criminal syndicate called the Vethnari, which had been operating in the outer commerce lanes for 30 years, and they were specifically planning a full-scale incursion timed to coincide with the Galactic Commerce Summit. The Commerce Summit was the one moment every 4 years when the senior representatives of every major trade bloc were in transit simultaneously, meaning Kethvara, through which most of the major transit lanes ran, would be handling an extraordinary volume of critical shipments, diplomatic goods, and high-value cargo. It was, in terms of targets, the best possible moment to strike. Sova's report also identified something else. The incursion wouldn't come through the primary transit lanes, where security was heaviest. It would come through an obsolete maintenance corridor network that the station systems classified as decommissioned and therefore didn't actively monitor. The decommissioned corridors had been identified as a vulnerability in a security review 11 years ago. The review recommended sealing them. The sealing had been scheduled, then delayed, then rescheduled, then deprioritized due to budget allocation cycles, and then, in the particular way that bureaucratic things sometimes go, simply forgotten. They were still there, open, unmonitored, running through the entire internal structure of the station. Sova's report went to Station Commander Veth Admiral Kreth Alaz, a Vrethkai officer who had commanded Kethvara for 18 years. He read it. He filed a response 48 hours later. The response said, in official language, that the analysis methodology used by analyst Sova was not consistent with certified galactic security assessment protocols, that the conclusions drawn exceeded the evidence provided, and that the team's access to station vulnerability data was being reviewed. It also said the decommissioned corridors had been reevaluated internally and were not considered an active risk. Dira Voss read that response and said to her team, in the privacy of their assigned quarters, "Okay, we do it ourselves." Doing it ourselves turned out to mean a lot of things. It meant Rosalind Emhara spending 3 nights in a row working on sensor arrays, splicing her own portable monitoring equipment into the decommissioned corridor access points with components she'd brought in her personal gear, because she'd apparently anticipated this exact situation. It meant Specialist Akampong physically walking every decommissioned corridor segment that Emhara's sensors identified, walking them in person, in the dark, because the lighting in the decommissioned sections had been shut down when the sections were deprioritized, cataloging access points, structural conditions, and potential defensive positions. It meant Dr. Cal setting up an unauthorized medical triage station in a storage room, because the station's medical bay was on the opposite side of the primary transit hub from the decommissioned corridors, and if something happened fast, distance would matter. And it meant Petrasova continuing to build her probability model, refining it nightly with new data, watching the probe frequency increase on the sensors she'd helped Emhara install, tracking the pattern as it tightened. On the 61st day of their embed, she came to Dira Voss at 300 station time and said, "It's not during the summit." Dira looked up from the map she'd been working on. Sova said, "I had the timing wrong, or not wrong, incomplete. The summit is the cover, not the target window. The actual incursion is 72 hours before the summit opens, when security attention is highest at the primary corridors and lowest at the secondary access, because everyone is managing the incoming transit surge." Dira said, "How confident are you?" Sova said, 81%, which in my modeling means. "I know what it means," Dira said. 72 hours, that's 33 hours from now," Sova said. Dira sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Wake everyone up." What followed is difficult to narrate cleanly, because it happened in several places simultaneously, and because much of what I know comes from after-action accounts rather than real-time observation. But here is the shape of it. The Vethnari Syndicate entered Kethvara Station through the decommissioned maintenance corridors at 4:12 station time. There were 41 of them. That number came out in the official count later. 41 trained operatives from a species that had been running criminal operations in deep space for 3 decades, moving through tunnels they'd spent months mapping remotely, coordinated by a command structure that had clearly been planning this for a long time. They were expecting an empty corridor network. They found Specialist Yaw Akampong. I'm going to tell you what Akampong said about this in his after-action testimony, because I think it captures something that's hard to get any other way. The testimony interviewer asked him, "Can you describe your psychological state when you first made contact with the lead Vethnari unit?" Akampong said, "I wasn't thinking about psychology. I was thinking about the next 3 minutes." Interviewer, "Were you frightened?" Akampong, "Sure." Interviewer, "How did you manage that?" Akampong, "I just did the thing. If I'm scared and I do the thing, I'm a scared person who did the thing. If I'm scared and I don't do the thing, I'm a scared person who didn't. I knew which one I wanted to be." Akampong was positioned at a T-junction in Corridor D7 Secondary, which Emhara's analysis had identified as the most probable choke point for the incursion route. He was alone. That was intentional. The corridor was wide enough for the Vethnari to move in a spread formation, which meant a single defender at the junction created a focal point. Everything coming through had to pass him or go around, and the around was covered by sensors that would alert the rest of the team. He had light body armor from their personal kit. He had a compressed pulse disruptor, which is a crowd management weapon, non-lethal at standard settings, designed to temporarily destabilize nervous system function in most galactic species. He had a sidearm, and he had, by his own account, a very complete map of the junction in his head because he'd walked it 40 times in the previous week. The first Vethnari unit came around the corner and stopped, because there was a human standing there. And humans, at that point in history, were not supposed to be part of any security arrangement at Kethvara. The Vethnari's intelligence had been thorough, and they'd been thorough specifically because the Vrethkai security architecture was well documented. Humans weren't in the documentation. This pause, this moment of genuine confusion, lasted probably 4 seconds. In combat contexts, 4 seconds is a very long time. Akampong used 3 of them. The compressed pulse burst caught the front 4 operatives simultaneously. 3 of them went down. 1 stumbled, hit the wall, stayed upright. Akampong had already moved, not retreating, moving laterally, changing angle, which the Vethnari apparently weren't expecting because their own security training emphasized holding defensive positions rather than dynamic repositioning. He maintained the junction for 7 minutes. 7 minutes alone, against operatives who outnumbered him better than 6 to 1, in a dark corridor, running on no sleep, and the particular kind of human determination that doesn't make a lot of logical sense if you analyze it from the outside. He was hurt. I want to be honest about that. He took injuries during those 7 minutes that required significant medical attention later. He wasn't invulnerable. He wasn't a machine. He was a person who decided he wasn't moving from that junction, and who meant it, and who had the physical and psychological architecture to make good on it even when it cost him. 7 minutes was enough time for Dira Voss and Haverson to reach Corridor D7 from their positions on the adjacent access routes. What happened next is better understood as a series of cascading decisions made at high speed under conditions that were trying very hard to kill everyone involved. Dira Voss had a communications unit. She was using it to coordinate with Emhara, who was back at their monitoring station tracking Vethnari movement through the sensor net. Emhara had a full picture of the corridor network that no one else in the station had, because the official systems weren't monitoring the decommissioned sections. So Emhara was, effectively, running the battle map. She called out positions. She called out when groups of operatives were splitting off from the main column. She called out when someone was trying to go around to find another access point to the primary station areas. And Haverson, who had spent the previous 2 months quietly but very thoroughly memorizing every access point and junction on the station, moved to cut those off. He did this 3 separate times. Each time, he arrived at an access point just ahead of or simultaneous with a Vethnari unit trying to get through. Each time, he sealed the access point with a manual override, a physical bolt lock that couldn't be digitally bypassed because it was a mechanical system from the original station construction, old enough to predate digital override compatibility. Nobody on the Vrethkai security team had known those locks existed. Haverson had found them during his personal corridor walks and had quietly confirmed with Emhara that they were still functional. He'd been thinking ahead. He'd been thinking about what he'd need if things went wrong. Humans do that. They think about what they'd need if things went wrong, often because things have gone wrong before and they've learned from the specific texture of how. On the primary station level, the situation was different. The Vethnari had a secondary team, not coming through the maintenance corridors. That was the distraction. The primary team, a smaller group, about 8 operatives, had entered through a legitimate cargo bay using forged transit credentials. This team had gotten into the main station. They were moving toward the central communications hub, which, if compromised, would have allowed them to knock out station-wide coordination and alert systems during what they planned to be the critical window. The Vrethkai security units on the primary level were in a confused state. The alerts coming from the decommissioned corridor network were coming from sensors that officially didn't exist anymore, Emhara's equipment, and the security AI was flagging them as potential system errors rather than genuine threats. The Vrethkai protocols required multiple verification steps before committing rapid response forces to unconfirmed alerts, which is extremely reasonable protocol, and also, in this moment, cost them about 12 minutes. Those 12 minutes were when the secondary Vethnari team moved. Dr. Fennec Cal was the only Frontier Solutions team member in the primary station area. He'd been in his unauthorized triage station when Emhara's alert came through. He is a doctor, this should be stated clearly. He is a medic, not a combat operative. His job on this mission was to ensure that if the team took casualties, they had immediate care. He looked at his situation. He had a comm unit. He had medical equipment. He had a clear head and 30 years of working in emergency contexts that were not designed for emergency response. And he made a decision. He called the cargo bay supervisor. Not security, not the command center. The cargo bay supervisor, a Velashan station worker named Orvith Kalla who'd been processing manifests on the overnight shift and was absolutely not prepared to be called by a human doctor at 4:30 station time to be told that 8 armed operatives had just walked through Bay 7. Cal didn't explain everything, he said. Bay 7, 8 unauthorized personnel. I need you to seal the bay from outside right now and call me back with the confirmation code. Kalla said, who authorized? Cal said, nobody authorized it. Call the bay supervisor line, get the seal code, seal the bay, call me back. You have about 90 seconds. He hung up and called the station's janitorial dispatch. He called janitorial dispatch because he'd spent 2 months learning the station, and he knew that the fastest way to get physical bodies to any location in the primary station wasn't security. It was maintenance, because maintenance had people in every corridor all the time. He told the dispatch coordinator, another overnight staffer, another person absolutely not prepared for this call, that there was a chemical spill concern in the communications hub corridor, and that he needed a physical barrier team to seal off access pending hazard assessment. The maintenance coordinator, following procedure, deployed a physical barrier team to the communications hub corridor. 3 maintenance workers, the Velashan station staff, no combat training, just people doing their job, showed up in the corridor with their equipment and standard high-visibility barriers. The Vethnari secondary team, moving through that corridor, stopped. Because the corridor was blocked by maintenance workers. The Vethnari operatives were highly trained. They were prepared for security resistance, automated countermeasures, and armed response. Their threat assessment architecture included a long list of things they were ready to deal with. 3 maintenance workers with physical barriers was not on the list. There was a moment, a pause, a hesitation that lasted maybe 15 seconds, which was long enough for the Vrethkai security verification process to complete and for rapid response units to receive their deployment orders. The secondary team was secured before they reached the communications hub. Cal, in his testimony later, was asked, "Were you frightened?" He said, "Terrified, absolutely terrified." "What did you do with that fear?" He said, "I made phone calls. Fear is energy. You can use it for things." The main corridor engagement ended at 5:51 station time. It ended not because the Vethnari forces were fully neutralized. Some of them had retreated back through the decommissioned corridors toward their entry points, but because the station's rapid response units, finally fully operational and working from Emhara's corridor map, which had been transmitted to the security AI as an emergency addendum, were able to begin systematic containment. The 6 Frontier Solutions personnel, Voss, Haverson, Akampong, Sova, Emhara, and Cal, were not the reason the Vethnari failed to achieve their objective. That's not the right way to frame it. They were the reason the objective was possible to fail at. Without Sova's threat analysis, the incursion would have been a surprise. Without Emhara's sensor network, there would have been no visibility into the decommissioned corridors during the attack. Without Akampong holding the junction for 7 minutes, the Vethnari would have been through the corridor network and into the primary station before anyone knew what was happening. Without Haverson's sealed access points, the flanking routes would have succeeded. Without Cal's 2 phone calls to the cargo supervisor and the maintenance dispatcher, the secondary team would have reached the communications hub. And without Dira Voss, who coordinated all of it simultaneously from a position that required her to be in continuous communication with 5 people, while also moving through an active corridor engagement, it would have been impossible to sequence. I'm not doing this well, trying to describe what they did in those hours, because what they did was so thoroughly not the kind of thing that any existing framework was designed to evaluate that the frameworks kept failing. The after-action assessment protocol required rating performance against standard security benchmarks. The benchmarks didn't have categories for anticipated the incursion a day early, or built a sensor network in their downtime, or talked 3 maintenance workers into accidentally blocking a combat team, or held an intersection alone for 7 minutes because you decided you were going to. The benchmarks kept returning insufficient data. Keth Advisor S. Sarvan Thrall was on the station. He'd arrived 2 days before the incursion for summit preparation. He was in his quarters when the alerts went out. By the time the situation had resolved, he was in the operations center watching the debrief reports come in. I wasn't there for this part, but it's on the record because the operations center was monitored and because nobody thought to pause the record during what happened. Thrall asked for a full incident timeline. He read it. It took him about 12 minutes, which for a Vrethkai of his experience is a long time to read anything. Then he asked for a summary of what each Frontier Solutions team member had done during the engagement. He read that too. Then he was quiet for what the record shows was nearly 3 minutes. Then he said, "Who authorized the sensor installation in the decommissioned corridors?" The operations officer said, "Nobody, sir. The human team installed it on their own authority." Thrall said, "On whose operational authorization?" The officer said, "None on record." Analyst Sova cited provisional contract language allowing operational discretion in service of the consultation mandate. Another silence. "The maintenance barrier deployment," Thrall said. "The humans called janitorial services." "Yes, sir. Dr. Cal called the overnight maintenance coordinator and told them there was a chemical spill risk. The physical barriers were a standard hazmat response deployment." Thrall said, "They called janitors to block a Vethnari combat team." "It worked, sir." Another silence, longer this time. I have tried, in thinking about this, to imagine what was happening in Thrall's mind during those silences. He had been doing interstellar security and diplomacy for 200 years. He had seen sophisticated operations, had studied military history across dozens of species, had operational experience that most beings never accumulate. He had called the idea of hiring humans insane. In a room full of people, loudly. And then he'd been right there in the station, while those humans prevented what would have been the most significant criminal incursion in Kethvara's history. He said, finally, to the operations officer, "Get me a meeting with Director Voss." The meeting between Thrall and Dira Voss is also on the record. They met in one of the station's secondary conference rooms. No aides, just the two of them. Thrall is 7 feet of Vrethkai sophistication, 2 centuries of experience, a being who has negotiated across star systems and commanded operations of extraordinary complexity. Dira Voss, at that moment, had a bandaged left arm where debris had caught her during the corridor engagement and hadn't had time to sleep in over 30 hours. Thrall sat across from her and said, "Your methodology is inconsistent with every security framework the Council recognizes." Dira said, "I know. Your team installed unauthorized equipment, violated access protocols, engaged in uncoordinated operations, and made decisions outside the scope of your authorization." "Yes." "All of which was effective." "Yes." Thrall's secondary limbs adjusted, the Vrethkai equivalent, I'm told, of something like a deep breath. He said, "Explain it to me, not the operation, the thinking behind it." Dira Voss looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "We're new. We've been in space for 40 years. Every species in that chamber has been doing this for longer than our civilization has existed in its current form." "We know that." "Then why?" "Because being new isn't only a disadvantage," she said. "Being new means you haven't built frameworks yet. It means you still look at a problem and see all of it instead of just the parts your frameworks are designed to see. Your security AI is extraordinary. The Vrethkai protocols are extraordinary, but they were built on the assumption that threats will behave in predictable ways, because you've been doing this long enough that you've learned what predictable threats look like. And when they don't, you need someone who thinks the same way, someone who will improvise, someone who will call a cargo supervisor and janitorial dispatch in the middle of a combat incursion, because those calls might work, and doing the unexpected thing is sometimes the only thing that works." Thrall was quiet. Then he said something that I think matters more than almost anything else in this record. He said, "I called your presence here insanity, publicly." Dira said, "I remember. I was wrong." She looked at him. He said, "Not about your inexperience. That was accurate, but wrong about what inexperience necessarily means. I confused unfamiliarity with incapability. I confused not recognizing your framework with the absence of one." He paused. "You do have a framework. It simply is not like any I have encountered." Dira Voss, after a moment, said, "We call it improvisation, or sometimes just stubbornness." "It is neither of those things," Thrall said. "It is something I do not have a word for yet, but I think the galaxy may need it." The Galactic Commerce Summit went forward on schedule. The Vethnari incursion failed completely. The Syndicate's 41 operatives were detained. The secondary team was secured. No significant cargo or communication damage was done. The decommissioned corridors were, finally, sealed permanently this time. Frontier Solutions received a formal commendation from the Council. Council Chair Oris presented it personally. And in the chambers where, 2 months earlier, the entire assembled diplomatic community of the Galactic Commerce Network had laughed at the idea of hiring humans, those same delegates listened as the incident was described in detail. What the humans had found, what they had built, quietly, in their own time, what they had held against odds that no logical threat assessment model would have rated as survivable. I was back in my observer's gallery. The chamber was very quiet. S. Sarvan Thrall, from his elevated dais, said, "I have a formal statement to add to the record." And he said, "I called this arrangement insanity. I was wrong. And I am 200 years old, and I am telling you that I am wrong, because it is important to say true things even when they are uncomfortable ones." He paused. "Especially then. After Kithvara, things changed. Not immediately. Not all at once. Nothing in galactic politics changes all at once, because galactic politics is a machine with an enormous number of moving parts and enormous inertia, and moving enormous inertia requires not a sudden force but a sustained, patient, persistent one. But they changed. Frontier Solutions got their full contract, not a provisional observer embed, an actual operational security contract, with authority and resources, and a budget that the previous 6 months' budget would have fit inside with room left over. Other firms human-run, or at least human-partnered, started getting contracts that they'd previously been passed over for, not in a rush of sudden enthusiasm, but in a gradual, careful, watching to see if this works way that is characteristic of how the galactic community absorbs new information. Humanity, for its part, started getting invited to the table more. Not as a charity, not out of sentiment, as a practical acknowledgement that something useful lived inside the particular way humans approached problems. This is not the same as respect necessarily. Respect takes longer, but it is the beginning of the conditions under which respect becomes possible, and that is something. I kept working as a trade liaison. I watched the next several years unfold from various positions: the Lashen Station, the Meridian Commerce Bureau's field offices, twice more at Kethvara on standard diplomatic rotations. I saw the Frontier Solutions team occasionally. Not often. They were busy. Their contract expanded again, and then again, until they were effectively the lead security consulting firm for the Eastern Commerce Lanes, which covered something like 12 star systems and a transit volume that would have been unimaginable when they first stood up in that council chamber. Dira Voss went from field operations to operational command. She still worked long hours and she still had the face that had been through weather, except there was more of it now. The kind of more that comes from carrying responsibility that doesn't let you put it down. Jeet Haverson stayed in field operations, which seemed to be what he preferred. There are people who want to lead and people who want to be at the sharp end, and he was firmly the second type. Petrosova built threat analysis models that eventually got licensed by 3 different species security agencies. Her methodology, integrating behavioral pattern analysis with what she called intuitive deviation tracking, which was a technical way of saying she could model how non-rational actors behaved, turned out to be genuinely novel. Nobody had built exactly that before, because nobody had come to the problem with exactly her background. Rosalind M. Hara went into independent consulting on sensor architecture. She became one of the foremost authorities on detection systems across multiple technology platforms, which I don't think surprised anyone who had seen her work. Dr. Cal retired eventually. He gave a lecture at the Galactic Medical Institute that is, I'm told, still studied. Specialist Akampong left Frontier Solutions after several years and returned to a human colony called Kemarin, where he apparently raised a family and grew crops and was, by all accounts, happy. He did not attend the commemorations. He said, when asked why not, "I did my part. The next part is someone else's." I should tell you about the moment the insanity accusation became, permanently, a different kind of thing. It took several more years, and it didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one building on the last, each one quietly shifting the galactic community's understanding of what humans were and what they brought. But there was a moment, a specific documentable moment, when the phrase "you actually hired humans" stopped being an expression of incredulity and became something else. It happened during the Kethvara commemorative session, 5 years after the incursion. Every 5 years, the Council holds a formal session to review significant incidents and extract learnings for policy. S. Sarvan Thrall was at the session. He'd been part of every Kethvara review since the incident. A junior delegate from one of the newer trade bloc members, a species called the Vorath Kai who had joined the network only recently, asked, during the open discussion period, about the human involvement in the incident. He asked it slightly skeptically, because the Vorthkai had heard the original story from older members of their diplomatic community, and the framing they'd heard was, "The humans were lucky." He said, "Actually, is it not true that the success depended heavily on fortunate circumstances, and that the human team's methods, while effective in this case, were fundamentally improvised and therefore unreliable?" There was a moment in the chamber. And then Keth Advisor S. Sarvan Thrall, who had been doing this for more than 2 centuries, who was the most senior diplomatic voice in the room, who had been personally wrong about this in the most public way possible, said, "No." He said, "Let me explain something about improvisation. The assumption behind your question is that improvisation is the absence of method, that it is random, that its success is therefore a matter of chance. This assumption is common and it is incorrect." He said, "Improvisation, the particular kind these humans demonstrated, is not the absence of preparation. It is a different form of preparation. They prepared not for the scenario they expected, but for the failure of the scenario they expected. They built redundancy into their methods, installed systems nobody told them to, learned the physical environment beyond their assigned scope, and made relationships with station personnel that had no operational justification, except the possibility that those relationships might be needed someday." He said, "When the scenario failed in ways nobody predicted, they were ready for the failure, not because they had predicted it, but because they had prepared for the concept of unpredicted failure." He paused. "That is not luck, that is a philosophy, and it is one the galaxy did not have before humanity brought it." The chamber was very quiet. The young Vorthkai delegate said, "That is a significant statement, Keth Advisor." Thrall said, "It is an accurate one. Accuracy is what the occasion requires. The phrase 'you actually hired humans' is now part of galactic slang. I should mention that. It has inverted completely. It started as mockery, an expression of incredulity that anyone would rely on the newest, least experienced species in the network for anything important. Over the following decades, it became something else, an expression of approval, of knowing, of recognizing that someone has made a smart choice in a difficult situation. When something works against the odds, when a small team outperforms expectations, when creativity and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that losing is the only option produces an outcome that shouldn't have been possible. The shorthand for it, across multiple species and trade languages, is that phrase. Oh, they hired humans. Said with admiration, said with a particular kind of recognition. I've heard it dozens of times over my career, used in contexts that have nothing to do with humans directly, sometimes applied to small teams of other species who display what has come to be called human methodology, meaning the combination of preparation for failure, improvisation, stubbornness, and the use of assets that weren't intended to be used in that way. That's the human approach, people say, when they mean. They did the unexpected thing and it worked, and they were prepared for it to work because they'd thought about it long before the moment arrived. I want to tell you about one more thing. Late in my career, I was part of a delegation that visited a newly contacted species, the Valori, a civilization that had just achieved interstellar capability and was beginning the long process of integrating into the galactic network. The first contact protocols are elaborate and ceremonial and very old, because the galactic community has been meeting new civilizations for a very long time and has learned, through experience, how to do it in a way that is dignified for everyone involved. At one of these early contact sessions, a Valori leader, an elder named Boris Ven, who had the particular gravity of someone who has spent a lifetime thinking carefully about large questions, asked our delegation a question. He said, "We have been studying your historical records in preparation for this meeting. We have many questions, but the one that interests me most is this. which species, in your experience, has contributed most unexpectedly to the galactic community? Not the oldest or the most powerful, the one you were most surprised to learn from. There was a moment where the various delegation members considered their answers. Then one of the senior delegates, an Uli ambassador named Vethsira, who had been in the Interstellar Diplomatic Corps for longer than I'd been alive, said, without hesitation, "Humans." Borisvin said, "Why?" And Vethsira said, "Because when we first met them, we thought they had nothing to teach us. We had been in space for centuries. They had been in space for decades. We had sophisticated systems, established protocols, long experience. They had enthusiasm, flexibility, and what we interpreted as a troubling tendency to ignore established procedure." She said, "It turned out the enthusiasm was actually extraordinary resilience. The flexibility was actually a sophisticated preparation for unknown circumstances. And the tendency to ignore established procedure was actually a capacity to see past the boundaries of what established procedure was designed to handle." She said, "We laughed at them in the beginning, more than once. The laughter was genuine, we were not being cruel, we simply could not understand why they were here, what they offered that we didn't already have." She paused. What we didn't have was them, their specific way of approaching problems, their refusal to accept that the ceiling of what was possible was defined by what had been done before, their capacity to find resources in places nobody thought to look, to call the janitors and the cargo supervisors, so to speak. Borisvin said, "Janitors and cargo supervisors." Vethsira smiled. "It's a full-face expression for the Uli. I'd never seen her do it before in the months of first contact proceedings." She said, "I'll tell you the story sometime. It's a good one. I am old now, by human reckoning, though not by the reckoning of most species I've worked with. I've spent my career in the Meridian Commerce Bureau, moving between stations and diplomatic posts and transit corridors, watching the galaxy do its complicated, slow, magnificent, maddening work. I've watched species negotiate and argue and come to agreements and break them and come to new ones. I've watched the network of relationships and contracts and mutual dependencies that constitutes galactic civilization hold itself together through crises and through the slower, harder work of ordinary complicated times. And I've watched humanity find its place in all of it. Not quietly, not easily, through work, through friction, through the accumulation of moments where the rest of the galaxy laughed and then was surprised and then, slowly, learned to stop being surprised. I want to tell you what I think matters about the Kithvara story, not the tactical details, those are in the records. What I think matters about the larger shape of it. It is this. The moment Sarvan Thrall stood up in the commemoration session and said publicly that he had been wrong, that moment was itself a product of the human approach. Because Thrall is not a person who makes public admissions of error easily. Vrethkai culture does not particularly honor public self-correction the way some other species do. What Thrall did in that session cost him something. He did it because he had watched the humans, not just the Kithvara incident, all of it. He had watched them absorb the laughter without flinching. He had watched them keep working when they had every official reason to give up. He had watched them prepare for failure and then succeed anyway and then, crucially, not make a production of it. Dira Voss didn't grandstand after the incursion. She wrote her incident report, attended her debriefs, and asked what the next contract was. He had watched them and learned something. And then he did the thing that humans do, the thing that I think is the most human thing of all. He looked at what he'd believed, and what the evidence showed, and he updated his belief, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant saying it out loud. I was wrong, here is what is actually true. That in all its awkward, self-exposing, costly honesty is the thing. The last time I saw Dira Voss was at a transit hub on Meridian Station, 2 years before I retired. She was older, we both were, and moving through the transit lounge with the particular efficiency of someone who has spent their life in transit hubs and learned to navigate them the way water navigates rock. She stopped when she saw me. I wasn't sure she'd remember me. We'd spoken once, in a lounge, waiting for a dock to clear years and years before. I was nobody, a junior liaison with a lot of unanswered questions. She said, "Coordinator Tyne." She remembered my name. I said something awkward about it being a long time. She agreed that it had been. Then I said something I'd been thinking about for years. I was in the gallery that day, when they laughed. She said, "I remember the day." I said, "I watched you wait for them to finish. I've thought about that moment a lot, how you just waited." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "What else would I do? Some people would have left, withdrawn the proposal." "Some people," she said. And then, after a moment, "I grew up in a place where things went wrong a lot. You learn either to leave when things go wrong or to wait for them to stop going wrong and then keep going. I learned the second one." She shrugged, a very human gesture I've always thought, the way it contains whole complex states in a single motion. The room was laughing. The problem wasn't going to stop existing because they were laughing. Kithvara still needed the thing we could offer. I said, "Was it hard, not reacting?" She said, "Sure, but hard is just what it costs. You pay it or you don't." Her transit call came through. She nodded at me with the particular courtesy of someone who is always moving and always acknowledging that the world contains other people even when she's moving. She went,